The dog throughout history has been considered the best friend of man. His loyalty and company have transcended cultures and times. But what the Alcorão tells us about this faithful animal, it is possible that the dog has a spiritual meaning that has been overlooked during centuries. In this video we will explore background, the mentions of the dog in the scriptures, and we will find out if it is just a common animal or if behind its apparent simplicity hides a truth spiritual. We will analyze the passages, biblical ones, in which the dog already appears, either as a symbol of impurity or as reflection of qualities such as loyalty and protection. At the end we will ask ourselves, is the dog a spiritual animal according to the Alcorão? Stay with us until the ending to discover the truth about the role of the dog in sacred texts. The dog has been one of the most important animals close to human beings since ancient times immemorial. Their loyalty, company, and utility in everyday life have become a constant presence in various cultures around the world. In the biblical context, however, his role seems to be more ambiguous. Often is mentioned in passages that associate him with purity, which has led to many negative interpretations about their presence in the scriptures. But this is all that the Alcorão has to say about dogs, or there is something deeper that has not been explored completely. In this analysis we will see how the Alcorão refers to dogs, trying to unravel if there is a hidden spiritual symbolism behind this faithful companion of man. The first aspect we must consider, it is the cultural context in which the biblical texts were written. In the ancient Israel, dogs were not seen in the same way as today, although in some ancient cultures such as in Egypt, dogs were valued as pets and protection. In the biblical context, dogs often they lived on the streets and associated with impurity. This vision is clearly reflected in several passages of the Alcorão, where dogs are mentioned alongside impure or undesirable elements. By example, in the book of Proverbs he says, like a dog that returns to its vomit, this is the fool who repeats his foolishness. This verse uses the image of the dog in a clearly negative, assimilating their behavior to human foolishness. Through this analogy, the Alcorão underlines one of the characteristics of the dog, that is, perceived his nature as undesirable, impure, and her inclination to perform actions that were considered repulsive. However, it is interesting note that this is not the only one perspective found in the writings. Although it is true that many mentions of dogs in the heart they associate with negative elements such as impurity or baseness, there are other passages that, although they indirectly suggest something deeper into the role of these animals in the Gospel of Luke. By, for example, we are told the story of a poor man named Lazarus who lay covered with sores at the gates of a rich man. The dogs, according to him text, they came and licked their wounds. At first glance this image might seem simply a description of the state pitiful of Lazarus, but it can also be interpreted as an act of compassion. Dogs licking the sores of the man are acting in a way that symbolically reflects mercy and the consolation. This opens the door to a interpretation different. Although the dogs in the heart they are often associated with the impure, they can also represent in some cases compassion and relief in the midst of the suffering. Another interesting passage finds in the book of Job, where Job mentions that not even the dogs of their cattle would be treated the same way, the way he has been treated by his friends. Here here, although the reference is secondary school recognition is noted. Dog as a being that to a certain extent deserved respect, although the dog was not at the level of other animals in the biblical context like the sheep or the ox. His presence was deeply intertwined with the daily life of the people, especially in pastoralism and the protection of livestock. In this way, the dog, although often marginalized in the scriptures, it also has a role, functional and protective, what can be interpreted as a positive quality, reflecting aspects of loyalty and surveillance. If we analyze further the symbolism of the dog in the Alcorão, we find that their loyalty is a feature that, although not mentioned directly in many passages, is intrinsic to the nature of this animal in biblical times. Dogs, they were often used as guardians, protecting the flocks and herds. Properties of its we love. This protective and loyal function may have a spiritual meaning, deeper especially if we consider loyalty to be one of the most important values in the relationship between the believer and God. Alcorão in many of his books underlines the importance of faithfulness to God and to stand firm in the faith even in times of difficulty. Although dogs are not presented explicitly as examples of loyalty, their behavior in daily life, biblical people could have served as a constant reminder of the importance of loyalty and surveillance. In addition to loyalty, other interesting aspect of the symbolism of the dog is his role as protector in the ancient world. Dogs, they were valuable not only for their loyalty but also for its ability to protect, were used to care for flocks and keep the predators. This function of protector, it can also have a connotation spiritual in various parts of the Alcorão. Prophets and religious leaders, they are called to be guardians of the people, protecting them from evil and guiding them towards the path of the justice. In a similar way to dogs, although they are not mentioned directly in this context, they can represent this idea of protection and surveillance on the spiritual plane. Believer is also called to be vigilant to protect his faith and resist malignant influences. The relationship of dog with surveillance can connect with the biblical concept of always being attentive to the signs of God and to the spiritual dangers that can threaten faith. In this sense, the dog, as a guardian, he can be seen as a reminder of the need to be constantly vigilant in our spiritual life, attentive to the negative influences that may to distance ourselves from our relationship with God. However, it is important to recognize that along the Alcorão, the dogs, they are also presented in a way negative in several passages. Its nature, street, and its presence on the margins of society links them with the impurity, a concept that was especially important in tradition Jewish in the Old Testament. Impurity was a central theme in the dogs living in poor conditions, hygienic, and eat the leftovers, that they were considered animals impure. This perception is clearly reflected in some passages of the Alcorão where dogs are used as metaphors for living the ungodly behavior or sinful. Despite this vision negative, we must not lose sight of the possibility that dogs, alike that other animals mentioned in the scriptures, may also have a more complex symbolism. As we have seen, their role as protectors and their loyalty can be considered qualities, spiritual values that reflect important in the life of faith. Although the Alcorão does not present them explicitly as spiritual animals, their behavior and its presence in life, everyday life of biblical people, may have served as a constant reminder of certain spiritual principles such as surveillance, fidelity, and the protection. In conclusion, although the dogs are mentioned in the Alcorão in contexts that often associate them with impurity or baseness, is also possible interpret their presence in a way more positive: his loyalty, his role as protectors, and their ability ability to offer comfort in times of suffering suggest that they may have a symbolism deeper than traditionally believed, recognized although they are not mentioned as spiritual animals in a sense. Formal the dogs through their behavior and its characteristics can teach us ions important about loyalty and vigilance in our life of faith by so much perhaps the dog beyond his marginal role in the scriptures has something more to offer in the field spiritual than at first sight it seems when exploring the scriptures with an open mind can be found in. They are a reflection of the qualities that God values: loyalty in his followers, the service, protection and compassion towards the further needed in the end even if they are not given the prominence of other animals in the Alcorão. Dogs have their own place in the narrative, spiritual, serving as reminders, silent about the importance of certain virtues in the life of a believer. The heart throughout its books mentions many animals that in sometimes they acquire a symbolic value or spiritual. Some of these animals, like the lion or the lamb, have been elevated to recognizable symbols of power and sacrifice, while others, like the snake, have become symbols of evil or deception. However, the dog, an animal so close to the human being throughout history, has a much larger place, complex and in some cases marginal, within the scriptures. This raises a question: interesting, what role the dog plays in the Alcorão, and can this animal in some way to have a spiritual meaning that has not been considered completely? To answer this question is necessary to analyze how the dog appears in biblical texts, and what can we learn from these references. The dog in the context biblical did not enjoy the status that it has in modern society today. Dogs are beloved companions in many homes and they are valued for their loyalty and affection. However, in the biblical world, especially in the Old Testament, dogs were seen in a very negative way. Different were not considered animals of company, nor were they given respect which is given to other animals. Domestic in many passages are associated with impurity, baseness, and I abandon. This negative vision is reflected in some of the best-known passages that refer to these animals. In the book of Proverbs we find a verse that mentions dogs in a clearly context negative, like a dog returning to its home vomit. This is the fool who repeats his foolishness. This comparison is harsh and direct. The dog to return to its own vomit becomes an image of folly of those who do not learn of their mistakes and repeat the same ones. Actions destructive. In this case, the dog is not only a dirty animal or unworthy, but a symbol of foolish behavior and self-destructive. This passage reflects a vision in which the dog is used as a metaphor for something under a nature that is repugnant to its actions, not changes. Throughout the Old Testament, dogs appear in situations similar in the book of Exodus and in other texts of the laws of the Old Testament. Dogs are mentioned in relationship with ritual impurity, were considered animals that lived outside from home, wandering the streets and feeding on waste. This lifestyle contributed to their image as animals dirty and unwanted. In Deuteronomy, for example, it is mentioned that the salary of a dog cannot be offered as donation in the temple. This detail can seem minor, but it reinforces the idea of that dogs and everything related to them, they considered themselves impure and unworthy to be close to things. Saints, however, despite this, there is a predominant negative perception. Some passages that offer insight more nuanced of the dog. An example of this is found in the Gospel of Luke in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. In this story, Lazarus is a poor man who is full of sores and that lies at the rich man's door, longing to eat the crumbs that fall from his table. In the story, story it is mentioned that the dogs came and licked the sores of Lazarus at first sight. This image, it seems to simply reinforce the idea that the misery of Lazarus, who is so abandoned that even the dogs, strays, approach him. However, some scholars have suggested that the act of the dogs could also be seen as a gesture of compassion, although the dogs were not considered animals. Elevated in this case seem to be offering comfort to a man in the middle, his suffering. This is a perspective interesting that contrasts with other negative mentions of dogs in the Alcorão, as it suggests that even a despised animal may be capable of acts of mercy. And be careful, another notable passage that involves dogs is found in Psalm chapter 22, a text that in many it is sometimes interpreted as a prophecy about the suffering of Jesus on the cross. In this psalm, the author says, "Dogs have surrounded me, they have surrounded me. Gangs of evil ones drill my hands and my feet." Here the dogs are used as symbols of oppressors and enemies, or a representation of evil that surrounds the psalmist with danger and constant threat that faces. Although this passage continues using dogs in a way negative, the interesting thing is that again, dogs are not just animals but acquire a more symbolic meaning. Deep represent the evil that lurks and seeks to destroy the fair. Even though many of the biblical references about dogs, they tend to be negative, their symbolism is more complex than it seems at first glance. Seen in some cases, as in the Lazarus story, the dogs act as compassionate beings, while in others like Psalm chapter 22 represent the evil and oppression. This duality is interesting since shows that although the dog is not a spirit animal in the sense traditional, has a symbolic role that can be interpreted in several ways. Another aspect worth highlighting is the functional role of dogs in the daily life of people in the time biblical. Although they are not mentioned as pets, dogs, yes, they had a practical purpose in the society of the time, were used to protect flocks, to maintain away from predators, and to take care of the properties of this paper as guardians. Reflects another dimension of their character. Dogs, although marginalized in many biblical texts, can also be seen as symbols of protection, and they watch. In this sense, its function can be compared to that of the believer, who is also called to be vigilant, protect your faith, and stay alert in the face of danger. Spiritual. In addition to their role, dogs were also protective, known for their loyalty. Although this trait is not directly mentioned in the Alcorão, the nature of the dog as a loyal and faithful animal has been recognized throughout history. In biblical times, the dogs that they protected the flocks and properties, they did it with unwavering loyalty to their owners. This type of loyalty can be seen as a spiritual quality, a lesson on the faithfulness that the believers should show towards God. In several biblical passages, loyalty and loyalty are key values that are encouraged among the followers of God. Although dogs are not mentioned as examples of these values, their behavior in everyday life could have served as a constant reminder of the importance of loyalty in life. Spiritual. One last aspect to consider is the use of dogs in some biblical metaphors for describe the vigilance. In the book of Isaiah mentions the dumb dogs that do not they can bark, a reference to leaders, spiritual ones, who do not warn the people about the danger. Here the image of the dog returns to be negative, but indirectly highlights an important quality of the dogs, their ability to alert and watch out for dogs that don't bark when danger approaches. They are useless in the same way as the leaders who do not warn their people on spiritual dangers too are ineffective. This passage, although negative, reminds us the value of vigilance and importance of being attentive to the threats that may endanger our faith. The dog then occupies a ambivalent prominent place in the Alcorão, for a side is associated with impurity, baseness and danger. On the other hand, in certain contexts shows qualities of compassion, protection and loyalty. Although it is not a spirit animal in the classical sense, the dog has a symbolism that can be interpreted from different ways depending on the context. Its presence in the scriptures, it offers us the opportunity to reflect on the values of loyalty, surveillance and protection, and how these qualities are important both in the everyday life as in life spiritual. This analysis of the dog in the Alcorão leads us to reconsider its role. I already recognize that even if it is not high to the category of other animals symbolic in the scriptures such as the lamb or lion, his figure is loaded of a symbolism that transcends its nature. Physics reminds us that even in the most unexpected places we can find spiritual lessons valuable, and that often the animals that surround us can be reflections of the virtues that we must cultivate in our own lives. The dog has been a companion constant of the human being throughout history, playing roles important in different civilizations. Their proximity to the people, their loyalty and their ability to protect and care for what surrounds them, they have become a symbol of fidelity in many cultures. However, when we delve into the scriptures biblical, the image of the dog seems have a meaning different, often marked by the perception of impurity and marginality. This raises an interesting question about the place that the dog occupies in the heart, and if it is possible that this animal, despite its mentions negatives, have a more symbolic meaning deeper than we usually interpret. The Alcorão, especially in the Old Testament, offers several mentions of dogs, but many of them tend to be derogatory. In the ancient world, the dog, it was not the domestic and beloved animal that it is today in many parts of the world. In that context, dogs used to living on the periphery of society, wandering the streets in search of food and often eating leftovers and waste. For this reason, they were associated with the dirt and impurity, which influenced the way they were seen in the biblical texts in the book of Exodus and in other legal texts of the Old Testament. Dogs are mentioned along with impure or unworthy things presented as an offering to God. The simple fact that something related to dogs could not be used as a sacrifice in the temple already gives an idea of Baha consideration that they had in that society. One of the most passages known that refers to the dogs in a negative way is Proverbs, which describes a dog returning to its vomit as a metaphor for foolishness. The dog in this context not only is seen as impure but also as a creature that does not learn from its errors, that repeat behaviors repulsive. This analogy is not accidental. It reflects a broader vision on foolishness and sin in thought biblical. Just like the dog returns to his vomit, the fool repeats his faults again and again without correcting his behavior. Here the dog is used as a symbol of sin, persistent, and the inability to be human, to separate from what is harmful. This comparison reinforces the perception of the dog as a creature of low esteem, but at the same time puts the ability of the Alcorão as evident to use everyday items and close to illustrate moral lessons. Further, deep, however, not all references to dogs in the heart, they are exclusively negative. A passage interesting is found enters the Gospel of Luke in the history of Lazarus, the poor man covered in sores that lay at the doors of a man rich. In this story, the dogs are, they brought Lazarus close to lick his feet. wounds. Although this scene could be interpreted as another example of the pitiful state in which he was found, Lazarus, some interpreters have seen in this act of the dogs a gesture of compassion. In the ancient world was not. I knew a lot about the healing properties of animal saliva, but what is perceived is that the dogs in the midst of a society that I ignored Lazarus seemed to be the only creatures that showed any form of compassion towards him. This changes a little perspective on the dog in this passage. Although the image of the dogs licking Lazarus' wounds could reinforce the idea of his baseness, Social also suggests that in a context of suffering and abandonment, even an animal as marginalized as the dog can show gestures of compassion that humans fail in. Offer another notable mention of the dogs in the heart appears in the Psalm 22, a text that many associate with the prophecies about the suffering of Christ. In this psalm, the author describes how the dogs surround him, comparing their enemies with these animals. Here the dogs represent the forces evil that stalk him, the oppressors who are looking for their fall. This representation reinforces the association of the dog with evil and hostility. However, the interesting thing about this passage is that dogs not only they are physical animals in this context, but they acquire a more significant meaning. Deep symbolic is not just about animals, street people that surround me, but of the manifestation of forces, adverse ones that seek to destroy the righteous. This reminds us that in many passages from the heart, the animals are not simply physical beings, but they often represent something bigger and abstract. In this case, the dogs. They symbolize danger and threat, chaotic forces that oppose the well. Despite the negative connotations associated with dogs in the majority of the biblical references, it is important to consider its role in the daily life of people in the era. Although the Alcorão does not present the dogs in a favorable manner, it is likely that many of them played important functions in protection of flocks and properties. The dogs were known for being loyal guardians and vigilantes, which gave them a role essential in rural life. Even though they were not given a place of honor in the scriptures, his loyal behavior and its ability to protect without a doubt would have been appreciated by those who depended on them to safeguard their animals and lands. This duality between the negative perception of dogs and their utility in daily life could be explained by the fact that the dogs were seen as animals that they lived between two worlds, the clean world and controlled from the home, and the impure world and dangerous of the streets. It is interesting to note that although dogs are often associated with the impure, is also recognized as their ability to be faithful guardians in the spiritual realm. The idea of the surveillance is key in many passages of the Alcorão. Urges believers to be vigilant, to be at the mercy of spiritual threats that may jeopardize their faith. In this sense, the dogs, even if they don't explicitly mention in this context, could be seen as a reminder of the importance of surveillance. The fact that they were used to protect flocks and properties could have served as a metaphor for the need for protect one's faith and maintain it alert to evil. In addition, dogs were known for their loyalty, a characteristic that, although not it is mentioned directly in the texts biblical, is intrinsic to its nature. Dogs are animals that they form strong bonds with their masters, and that even in the worst circumstances remain faithful. This loyalty could be seen as a spiritual quality, an example of the fidelity that believers must show your heart to God. Repeat repeatedly on the importance of the faithfulness to remain loyal to God, even in times of adversity. In this sense, the loyal nature of the dog could be seen as a reflection of this virtue, spiritual even if it does not rise to the dogs as examples of fidelity in the writings. Their behavior in life daily would have been a reminder constant of what it means to be faithful, not only to others but also to God. Another biblical passage in which dogs they play an interesting symbolic role found in the book of Isaiah, where mute dogs are used as a metaphor to describe leaders, spiritual ones who do not warn the people about the danger. In this passage, dogs that do not they bark and are compared to guides, spiritual ones that do not fulfill their function to warn the people about the dangers, spiritual that is, are approaching. Although this is an image negative, also highlights a quality important thing about dogs is their ability to be alert and warn their masters about the danger. In this case, the dogs that do not bark are useless, but the passage implicitly acknowledges that dogs that do fulfill their function of warn are valuable. This image of dogs as watchmen connects with the idea of being spiritually alert to be able to discern danger and protect yourself, oneself and others from threats. Spiritual throughout the writings, dogs are used as symbols of impurity, foolishness and even evil. However, as we take a closer look at the mentions of, we also see the dogs in the heart, that in some cases they can be interpreted as beings that despite their marginality demonstrate compassion, loyalty and monitoring. Their role as protectors and guardians in the daily life of the people in biblical times could have served as a metaphor for the spiritual vigilance and fidelity that believers are called to show towards God even if he did not occupy a place elevated in the scriptures. The dogs, with their loyalty and ability to protect, offer a reminder that even in the most humble beings can find valuable qualities that reflect spiritual principles fundamental. The dog, like any another being in creation, can be seen through multiple lenses. Although the scriptures associate it mostly with the impure, we can also see in its natural behavior traits that tell us about values that are fundamental in the life of faith, compassion that they show towards Lazarus, role as guardians, and their loyalty unbreakable show us that despite of their low status in the biblical world, can teach us spiritual lessons important about surveillance, protection and fidelity that all believer must cultivate in his relationship with God. The dog, it has been considered a great animal importance in various cultures throughout history, has accompanied the human being since ancient times, playing key roles as protector, hunter and companion. Your closeness to people has generated an emotional connection deep, which has led to it being attribute various symbolic qualities depending on culture or religion in question. However, when we observe the treatment of the dog in the heart, we find a perception different, often negative or marginal. This raises a question on the true meaning, spiritual, if he has it from the dog. In the context biblical, it is possible that this animal too, despite the connotations that seem be mostly associated with impurity and marginality, contains a symbolism deeper than meets the naked eye. We could interpret in the scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, the perception of dog is associated with the impure, and in the ancient world dogs did not. They were seen as faithful companions that we recognize today in many cultures. Modern, instead of being animals, beloved and domesticated dogs often wandered the streets, subsisting feeding on the waste that they found. This lifestyle linked them with what dirty and despicable in biblical texts. Impurity is an important issue, and the dogs that were associated with the street and the dirt was perceived in a way denial. In fact, in some of the oldest passages of the Old Testament, dogs are mentioned in contexts that link them directly to ritual impurity. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy is prohibited to offer a dog's salary as a donation in the temple, which reinforces the idea that anything related to them was worthy of being presented before God. This negative view is reflected even more clearly in passages such as Proverbs, where dogs are used as symbols of foolishness and behavior destructive. One of the most verses known, he says, like a dog that returns to its vomit, this is how the fool repeats his foolishness. Here the dog is not only portrayed as a dirty animal but as an incapable being to learn from their mistakes, what reflects a human attitude of repetition of sins and lack of regret. This use of the dog as metaphor to describe foolishness underlines the negative role that this animal plays in many texts. In the biblical, he is associated with behaviors that are undesirable, both in moral terms and spiritual, which reinforces their image as an inferior and despicable being. Within the biblical context, however, although much of the mentions of the dogs in the heart there are some negative connotations, references suggesting a relationship more complex in the Gospel of Luke. For example, the story is told of rich man and Lazarus, the beggar Lazarus, who lay in the rich man's door covered with wounds, received comfort from dogs who came to lick their wounds. This image is ambiguous, since while dogs could be seen again as a representation of misery and impurity, could also be interpreted as creatures that differentiate from man. Rich show a kind of compassion towards the poor, even though the dogs were despised in society. In this story, act as the only ones who interact with Lazarus in his suffering, what could be seen as a metaphor of unexpected mercy too. Despite their condition, these animals, they demonstrate an attention that humans of history do not provide. In another passage, Old Testament sign Psalm chapter 22, dogs are mentioned in a way symbolic to refer to enemies surrounding the psalmist. The text says that a pack of dogs has surrounded him, in a description that evokes danger and stalking, although this is another reference which presents the dogs in a way negative. The interesting thing here is that it gives them a symbolic role beyond be simple animals. The dogs in this passage represent evil forces that seek to destroy the. This is precisely what leads us to think that the dogs, although often associated with the impure, can also acquire a value symbolic more broad, represent the threat, the danger constant that stalks the righteous man and faithful, which shows that in many cases the mentions of animals in the Alcorão go beyond their simple physical condition and are used for represent abstract ideas or spiritual. The dog, despite being generally linked to the marginal, it also fulfilled important functions in the daily life of people in the biblical times. Although they are not considered pets in the modern sense, dogs were used in many ancient societies to protect the flocks and herds. Properties were loyal animals and watchmen capable of staying alert in the face of any threat external. This protective function leads to reflect on a possible spiritual dimension of the dog that is not so obvious at first sight. Throughout the scriptures insist on the importance of surveillance in being always alert to dangers spiritual that lurk. Jesus in the Gospels, he tells his disciples to watch and 10. Pray not to fall into temptation. Even though dogs are not used as examples of surveillance in these texts, your behavior in daily life could have served as a reminder of the importance of being always alert and ready to face the threats, spiritual in addition to surveillance. Another trait that characterizes dogs. It is your loyalty. Although the heart does not exalt explicitly the loyalty of dogs, it is impossible to ignore this quality in animals that are used for protect and caring for. Dogs known for forming strong bonds with their masters remain loyal even in circumstances difficult. This loyalty, although it is not mentioned directly in the texts biblical, reflects a spiritual value. Key fidelity. Many passages God calls his people to be faithful and maintain your loyalty towards he even in the midst of trials and difficulties. Although dogs are not elevated as examples of this virtue, their behavior could have been a source of reflection on what it means being faithful to God. The dogs too, through their loyalty unbreakable, remind us of the importance of standing firm in our faith and loyalty throughout our life. Spiritual. In the book of Isaiah is mentions dogs in a way that reinforces this idea of surveillance and responsibility. Spiritual. The prophet describes the mute dogs that are a metaphor for spiritual leaders who fail to comply with their duty to warn the people about the dangers that are. The dogs that do not bark are approaching when danger is approaching, and you are just as likely that leaders who do not guide or protect to your people. This image reinforces the idea of that dogs, despite their image negative in other texts, are also recognized for their ability to be guardians and protectors. In this passage, dogs that do not fulfill their function barking is a warning about the importance of always being alert and fulfill our responsibilities. Spiritual. Surveillance is not just a task, physical, but also a spiritual task, and the fact that dogs are used as metaphors in this context suggests that his role as guardians has a more important meaning. Deep. The dog, despite being associated with the low and the impure in many biblical passages, seem to fulfill with symbolic functions that transcend his physical status. Although the scriptures they do not raise it to the level of other animals, symbolic like the lamb or the lion, role in everyday life and its natural features such as the vigilance and loyalty make him a reminder of certain principles. Spiritual. Important as well as dogs, they protect what has been entrusted to them. Believers are called to protect their faith and be attentive to the influences negatives that can keep them away from God. On the other hand, dogs too, they teach us about compassion and mercy. In the story of Lazarus, dogs are the only ones that show a gesture of care towards man, sick and abandoned. This scene reminds us that sometimes compassion can come from the even more unexpected places, those beings that society tends to marginalize or to despise. Through this story, we can reflect on the importance to show mercy and care towards others regardless of their social status or the circumstances in which it is. Find compassion is not exclusive of the powerful or the wise, but rather can manifest itself in any being, even in those who are considered lower or unworthy. The symbolism of the dog in the Alcorão, although generally negative, reveals a more complex and richer picture of what appears at first glance. Through his multiple appearances, the dog tells us remembers both the dangers of foolish and destructive behavior, such as the importance of surveillance, loyalty, and compassion. Although it is not an animal that is associated directly with the spiritual in the Alcorão, its natural characteristics and its role in daily life, people in biblical times suggest that even in the marginal we can find valuable lessons on how to living a life of faith. The loyalty of the dog to towards his master. His vigilance, constant in its ability to offer consolation in the midst of suffering, reminds us that in our walk spiritually we are called to be faithful, to always be attentive and show compassion towards those who care the most need. The dog has been since time remote an inseparable companion of the being. Humans throughout history have played important roles both in domestic life as well as in the field of the house and the protection. Your loyalty, vigilance, and ability to form strong bonds with people have turned it into a symbol of fidelity in many cultures. However, when we go into the biblical scriptures, the dog seems occupy a very different place than the one we give today. The mentions of the dog in the Alcorão, particularly in the Old Testament, are usually associated with the impure and the marginal. This contrasts with the positive image that we currently have of the dog as a pet and guardian. This contrast raises important questions about what it was like, the dog in biblical times, and what we can learn about its symbolism in the spiritual and moral context that the scriptures us present. The dog in the context of the biblical world did not enjoy the same status in societies contemporary in many cultures. Modern, the dog is seen as another member of the beloved family, and be careful though in ancient Israel and in other cultures dogs were stray animals living on the fringes of society, feeding on the waste they found and often leading a life in conditions difficult. This lifestyle gave them a negative reputation as they are associated with dirt and impurity. In the laws of the Old Testament, ritual impurity was an important topic, and dogs for their nature and habits were seen as impure. This perception is clearly reflected in passages like the one in the book from Deuteronomy, where it is mentioned that you must bring a dog's salary as an offering to the temple. This ban underlines the low consideration that was had of dogs in the ritual context, since anything related to them was considered inappropriate to be offered in an act of worship to God. Another important passage that reinforces this negative view of dogs is found in the book of Proverbs, where the dog is compared to the fool who repeats his mistakes. The verse says, like a dog that returns to its vomit. That's right, the fool who repeats his foolishness. This comparison is harsh and explicit and suggests that the dog with its repulsive behavior becomes a metaphor for human behavior, destructive. The dog does not learn from his mistakes, just like the fool who returns again and again time to the same actions that they harm. This passage is an example clear how dogs in the context biblical were often used as symbols of undesirable behavior. His impure nature and his inclination to do what was considered repulsive made them ideal to represent the foolishness and lack of wisdom. However, not all mentions of dogs in the heart are completely negative. In some passages we can find clues of a more ambiguous relationship, and in certain cases up to positive, among dogs and the beings humans. A notable example of this is found in the Gospel of Luke in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. In this story, Lazarus is a beggar covered in sores, lying at the door of the rich man waiting to eat the crumbs that fall from their table. Mentions that the dogs came and they were licking their sores. At first sight image, it appears to be simply a further illustration of the state of misery of Lazarus, since the dogs were seen like unclean animals that lived in the streets. However, some scholars they have interpreted this act of the dogs as a sign of compassion too, difference from the rich man who shows no interest in the suffering of Lazarus. The dogs, marginalized creatures, they are the only ones who they approach him him in his misery, and they offer a type of care even if it is rudimentary. This interpretation suggests that despite the negative reputation of dogs, even they can act with a kind of compassion, what contrasts with the indifference of the human beings in this. I recount another interesting passage in which dogs are mentioned is found in Psalm chapter 22, a text that many associate with the suffering of Christ on the cross. In this psalm, the author describes how a pack of dogs has surrounded him, using dogs as a metaphor of the enemies that the dogs lurk here. They are not simple animals but symbols of the forces, evil ones that seek to destroy the righteous. This symbolic use of dogs in the psalm reinforces the negative image that has them in other passages, since they are represented as a threat, source of danger, constant. However, the interesting thing about this passage is that dogs, although associated with evil, also acquire a deeper symbolic value, represent the forces that oppose justice and trying to overthrow the innocent, which reminds us that in the Alcorão animals often have a meaning that goes beyond its physical condition and are used for illustrate spiritual realities and morales more wide. Although most of the references to dogs in the heart they are negative, it is important to consider the role that these animals played in the daily life of the people in biblical times. Despite that dogs are considered impure, they fulfilled important functions in the ancient societies, were used to protect flocks and property, and were known for their loyalty and vigilance. Although they were not given the same status than other domestic animals such as sheep or oxen, their ability to protect and their loyalty to their masters were qualities valued. This protective role takes us to reflect on a possible spiritual dimension of the dog in the context biblical. In many passages it is urged to believers to be vigilant now, protect your faith from threats. Spiritual dogs, even if they don't mention directly in this context, they could have been seen as a reminder of the importance of surveillance in life. Spiritual capacity of dogs to protect what is entrusted to them can be a metaphor for the need for the believers to always be alert and ready to face the dangers that may threaten your relationship with God. In addition to its ability to protect, another characteristic that defines the dogs is their loyalty. Although the heart does not explicitly exalts the loyalty of the dogs, this quality is impossible in the animals that were used to care for flocks and properties. The dogs formed bonds, close ties with their masters, and remained loyal even in the most difficult circumstances. This loyalty, although it is not mentioned directly in the texts biblical, can be seen as a reflection of the faithfulness that God expects from his followers. In many passages of the may the heart be of fidelity and constancy in the relationship with God. Believers are called to be faithful to God even in times of test and difficulty. In this sense, loyalty of the dog can be a lesson about the faithfulness in spiritual life. Dogs with their loyalty unbreakable show us the importance of standing firm in our faith regardless of the circumstances. Another passage that uses the dogs of symbolically, it is found in the book of Isaiah, where the prophet describes mute dogs that do not. They can bark, a metaphor for the spiritual leaders who do not warn the people about the dangers that in this passage the dogs that come near. They don't bark, they are useless because they don't comply with its function of warning about the danger. This image forces the idea of that dogs, despite being marginalized, they are also recognized for their ability to protect and, in this case, alert the dogs that do not. They bark as a warning to the spiritual leaders, reminding them of the importance of always being vigilant and to fulfill their responsibilities. Although dogs are used in a negative way in this passage, the fact that its recognition distinction is made. As guardians, it reminds us that in the biblical context dogs also, they have qualities valuable as surveillance and ability to protect the dog despite to be generally associated with the impure in the heart seems to fulfill symbolic functions that transcend their reputation. Physics. Although most of the mentions of dogs in the scriptures introduce them their negative role in everyday life and its natural characteristics such as the loyalty and vigilance make him a reminder of certain principles, spiritual, important as well as dogs. They protect what is entrusted to them. Believers are called to protect their faith and always be attentive to the negative influences that may to distance them from God. On the other hand, symbolism of the dog in the history of Lazarus suggests that despite being even the most vulnerable, animals are marginalized, despised, can show compassion and be careful. Dogs, when licking sores of Lazarus, act with more humanity than human beings in history. What reminds us that compassion can come from the most unexpected places too. Through this story we can reflect on the importance of show compassion and care towards the others regardless of their social status or the circumstances in which it is. Find compassion is not exclusive of the powerful or the wise, but rather can manifest itself in any being, even in those who are considered lower or unworthy. The symbolism of the dog in the Alcorão, although generally negative, reveals a more complex and richer picture of what appears at first glance. Through his multiple appearances, the dog tells us remembers both the dangers of foolish and destructive behavior such as the importance of surveillance, loyalty and compassion. Although it is not an animal that is associated directly with the spiritual in the Alcorão, its natural characteristics and its role in the daily life of people in biblical times suggest that even in the marginal we can find valuable actions on how to live a life of faith. The dog has been one of the animals closer to human beings since ancient times. Immemorial has played multiple roles throughout history. Since loyal companion to guardian and hunter, his relationship with people has been forged through millennia, and today in day the dog is considered a member of the family in many cultures. Without, however, when we explore the treatment of the dog in the heart, we find that their role and symbolism are very different of those granted in the current in biblical times. Dogs did not enjoy the respect they have today, but were considered animals, impure and marginalized. Despite this, dog appears on several occasions in the scriptures, which brings us to we wonder if there is a more symbolic deep behind these mentions. The Old Testament contains several references to dogs, and most of they are not positive. In the society of the ancient Israel, dogs were not seen as pets, but rather they generally lived on the margins of society, wandering the streets and feeding on the waste. This image contributed to that they were associated with impurity and despicable. In the Mosaic Law, for example, dogs were considered unclean animals, and in several passages of the scriptures refer to they in a way derogatory. In the book of Exodus, prohibits offering a dog's salary as a donation in the temple, which indicates that anything related to them was not worthy of being in the presence of God. Another significant mention of the dogs in the Old Testament found in the book of Proverbs, where dogs are compared to fools. In this passage are said to be like dogs that returns to its vomit, such as the fool that repeats its foolishness. This comparison is strong and explicit and reinforces the image of the dog like a repulsive animal. The idea that say in this comparison is that just like the dog returns to what it is repulsive, the fool repeats his mistakes without learning from they. This image not only reinforces the negative view of the dog in the context biblical, but also also underlines a moral lesson important: the need to learn from mistakes and not go back to them. Behaviors destructive. However, although many of the references to dogs in the Alcorão have a negative connotation, not all mentions are so simple. In some passages the dogs they seem to play a larger role. Complex and interesting example is found in the Gospel of Luke in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus, he is a poor and sick man who lies the gates of the rich man, wishing feed on the crumbs that fall from at his table. The dogs are said to have come and they licked the wounds of Lazarus. At first seeing this pass may seem like just a further description of the suffering of Lazarus, since the animal dogs despised interact with him in his misery. However, some scholars have suggested that this act of the dogs can be interpreted as a sample of compassion. While the rich man ignores complete to Lazarus, the dogs' creatures marginalized and despised approach him and give him a kind of consolation. This interpretation leads us to reconsider the role of dogs in this passage, since although they are traditionally seen as impure, they also seem to be able to show compassion and care for the most vulnerable. Another significant passage which mentions dogs in a way symbolic is found in Psalm chapter 22, a text that has been associated with the suffering of Jesus on the cross. In this psalm, the author describes how a flock of dogs surrounds it, using the dogs as a metaphor to describe to the enemies that lurk. In this context, dogs represent the evil forces that seek to destroy the just. Although this passage reinforces the negative image of the dog as a symbol of danger and evil, as well illustrates how the animals in the Alcorão often take on a meaning broader symbolic. Dogs are not just physical animals in this psalm, but representations of spiritual forces that threaten the innocent already fair. Despite these representations, negative dogs too played an important role in the daily life of people in the time biblical, although they were not considered domestic animals in the same sense that today. Vital functions such as protection of flocks and properties. Dogs were valued for its ability to protect and warn of possible dangers, loyalty to their masters, and their vigilance. They constantly turned them into animals useful in everyday life. Despite his bad reputation in others aspects, this function of dogs as guardians and protectors leads to reflect on their possible symbolism in the context spiritual. In many passages of the Alcorão, the believers are exhorted to be vigilant and protect your faith from the threats spiritual. The capacity of dogs to protect what has been entrusted to them can be seen as a metaphor for the need for believers to be always alert and ready to face the spiritual dangers that may to distance oneself from God. In addition to his role as dogs were also protectors, known for their loyalty. Although the heart is not focused directly on the loyalty of dogs, it is impossible to ignore this quality. Dogs are animals that they form strong bonds with their masters and that remain faithful even in the more circumstances difficult. This loyalty can be seen as a spiritual lesson on the faithfulness that believers must show towards God. In several biblical passages is spoken of the importance of fidelity and maintain a constant relationship with God. Even in times of adversity, the loyalty of dogs towards their masters can serve as a symbolic reminder of the need to be faithful in our spiritual life. remaining firm in our faith despite the difficulties. An additional example of the symbolism of dogs in the Alcorão, found in the book of Isaiah, where it is mentions the dumb dogs that do not they can bark. This image is used as a metaphor to describe the spiritual leaders who do not comply with their duty to warn the people about the dangers that face the dogs that don't bark. When danger approaches, they are useless, just like the leaders who do not guide or protect their followers. This image of the dogs reinforces the idea that despite its bad reputation, are also recognized for their ability to be alert and warn of the danger. Although the passage in Isaiah uses the dogs of negative way, the fact that it is recognize their role as guardians of us. Remember that in the biblical dogs, they also possess valuable qualities such as surveillance and the protection. The symbolism of the dog in the Alcorão is therefore more complex than that appears at first glance. Despite that many of the references to the dogs are negative, their role in life, everyday life, and its characteristics, natural such as loyalty and surveillance, suggests that they may also have a symbolic value, positive. Like dogs, they protect what is entrusted to them. Believers are called to protect their faith and always be attentive to the negative influences that may separate them from their relationship with God. This dog's ability to protect and warning about danger can be seen as a metaphor for the importance of spiritual vigilance in the life of believers. On the other hand, the story of Lazarus and the dogs who lick his wounds shows us that even the most marginalized beings can show compassion and care. While humans in history ignore the suffering of Lazarus, the dogs approach him at his moment of need. This image leads us to reflect on the importance of compassion in our daily lives. Sometimes compassion and care come from the most unexpected places, and dogs in this story teaches us that even those who are considered inferior or impure can offer comfort and relief in times of pain. Compassion, it is not reserved only for the powerful or the wise, but can manifest itself through any being, even those that society despises. The dogs, so even though often associated with the low and the impure, in Alcorão we can also offer you important lessons about loyalty, vigilance, and compassion. Their role in the scriptures is more complex than it seems at first view, and reflect on their characteristics and behavior. We can find valuable lessons for our spiritual life through their unwavering loyalty to their masters. Dogs remind us of the importance of fidelity in our relationship with God through His ability to protect and be alert. They teach us on the importance of surveillance, spiritual, to always be attentive to the threats that may separate us from our journey of faith, and through it, compassion towards Lazarus shows us that even in the most unexpected places, we can find comfort and care. Throughout the scriptures, symbolism of dogs is remarkably varied, and although many times they are associates with impurity and negativity, its loyalty and vigilance characteristics, they don't pass unnoticed. In many passages, these animals appear as figures, despicable or unworthy because of the circumstances in which they lived in the ancient society. However, it is also interesting how their behavior, natural, offers us valuable lessons that can be applied to the field spiritual. One of the most important aspects highlights is the ability of dogs to be faithful and loyal to their masters. Although they are not mentioned in the Alcorão explicitly for his loyalty, this feature has been universally recognized throughout history and in various cultures. The dogs that guarded flocks, or they protected properties, they did it with a devotion rarely seen in others animals. This sense of loyalty can serve as an analogy for the faithfulness that God expects from His followers. The Alcorão Al-Qur'an emphasizes the importance of being faithful to the divine commandments even in times of adversity. Just like dogs, they protect what has been entrusted to them. Believers must protect and strengthen their with God, being loyal and constant in His faith. Loyalty is a value that stands out in many biblical stories, and although dogs are not the protagonists of these stories, their behavior is a reflection of this virtue. So important. Another aspect to take into account is the dog's function as guardian. In biblical times, dogs were used to warn about the presence of imminent dangers, protecting both people and the flocks. This ability to detect the danger and acting accordingly is a metaphor for spiritual vigilance that is required in the life of a believer. Human beings are called to always be alert to the temptations and threats that can get them out of their way. Spiritual. In the same way as a dog warns his master about the arrival of an intruder, believers must be in tune with their faith and teachings of God to avoid being swept away by negative influences or destructive if it seemed to you. This exploration of the symbolism of the dog in the Al-Qur'an. We invite you to subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Give it a like if you liked this video and share it your opinion on the. We would love to hear what you think on this topic and continue sharing.